With this section of the class or the course, we make an important transition. In the block of material that we've been doing since the exam, obviously not including the BSG simulation, we've been focusing on corporate level strategies, international strategies, alliances, M&As, those sorts of things. Tonight, the topic kind of takes a natural shift and says, okay, you've decided on those strategies. Now what are you going to do to implement those strategies? And that's where we're going to spend the last part of the class, is talking about how do you get execution and implementation. And obviously this is something you're getting a lot of practice with right now in the BSG. And I'm going to specifically tell you what parts of this you're getting to practice in the BSG. So this is what we're going to talk about on the 2 video segments before we meet on class on Wednesday. Whoops, went too far. I don't think the book does itself well with its extensive discussion of contrasting the traditional view of control and the contemporary view of control. It's like managing was so much easier back in the day, and they were able to have these linear processes, and now we have to have much more iterative processes. Well, okay, if we want to call it that way. But I do think the bottom graphic is actually pretty useful. One of the things that well, I shouldn't say one of the things, because there's 2 things there. But as you're guiding the ship, so to speak, as the CEO, you're thinking about down 2 separate tracks. One is, how are we doing, and are we still doing the right things? And that's the informational side. And the second side, the behavioral side, is, are people really doing what our strategy calls for us to do? And they're both very important as you lead a company. So information control, you are living this right now in BSG. It says the key question is our current strategy still working, or is it appropriate? Yes, that's exactly what you're dealing with in BSG. And so these sub-bullets are all the sorts of things that you're dealing with. In fact, as I mentioned in class the other evening, many of you could be diving a lot more into the information than you are. There's a lot of information available that is going to give you clues on how well your strategy is working and what you can do to better improve your strategy, or I should say your execution of the strategy. And some are taking much more advantage of that information than others. And so at the end of the class, when we see the various fallout, who ranked where in BSG, I can assure you that differences in the quality of informational control executed by the team plays a major factor in determining the performance outcomes. So these are the sorts of things. So what makes for a good system? Well, focusing on the right information. Yep, that's a part of BSG. Interpreted and debated face-to-face. In a lot of companies, that might not happen, but I sure hope in your BSG it is happening, because these are the sorts of conversations that you and your teammates should be having. What do we think Team X is going to do? What are they going to do with all that overcapacity? Are we comfortable making a big move in private label? What are the right profit margins? Should we expand that plant? What are we going to do about the exchange rates in Latin America? These are all great topics that you should be looking at the information. It's not cut and dried, because there's analysis involved, and then deciding. And so it says in there, the little box in the bottom of the screen, this is the information that keeps you awake late at night. And in a couple of class periods, we're going to watch a video by Anne Mulcahy, who was the CEO of Xerox during a really troubled time for Xerox. And she's going to talk about the number of sleepless nights she had as she was pondering some of these questions. That's the informational side. This is where you tweak your strategy, you make changes, this and that. The other side is the notion of behavioral control. This is a really surface introduction to the concept of strategic leadership, because this is about how do we make sure that the strategy is actually implemented by the rank and file. In BSG, this isn't an issue. You tell the computer what to do, and it's very faithful. It does what you tell it to do. Not surprisingly, human beings are not quite like that. So this textbook really has a great there's a lot of really positive aspects of the textbook, and I think this discussion is one of them. These are kind of schools, if you will, or general types of how companies go about making sure people do what they tell them to do. The first is the idea of boundaries, or in other parts of the slides, it calls them rules. So this is where you have a pretty well crafted set of, this is what you're supposed to do, this is not what you're supposed to do. And the textbook gives a good discussion that sometimes these are very positive to focus on short-term priorities. It allows you to very clearly lay out, this is what we're going to be, bang, 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 bang. And if it's not one of these things, we're not doing it. It's also typically associated with very efficient operations who have high standardization, so they've culled out all the waste because everything is done just according to plan, and if they see any deviations, they know that it wasn't the right thing to do. And then there's always that last bullet that says you need rules to keep people from doing bad things. I'm not going to comment on that further because let's make a transition. Another school of thought is that you largely exhibit or exert behavioral control through a strong culture. I'll talk more about that on some of the next slides, but from a strategic leadership standpoint, what's critical is you can never be static about your culture. It is an ongoing process to constantly, even if you have a great culture, to constantly refresh it so that remains your culture, because over time, drift can occur. One of the hardest things a CEO can try to do is to try to change the culture for the better of an organization. It's really not too hard to corrupt it. It's a lot easier to change it for the better. The third major school of thought is the idea of rewards, that you get the behavior you want by designing an appropriate reward system that naturally motivates people to do what you want them to do. And the watchword out of the book is that rewards should be fair and equitable, which is to say they should be transparent, they should be understood, and in the perfect world, people would say that's basically the right way to do it. It's easy to dump on the idea of rules. You would like to feel like you can migrate from rules more to a strong culture. And you see some of the benefits. These are the organizations where you walk into and it's just done our way. And the idea of doing it some other way is relatively unique. A company that's under a lot of attack right now that for years was lauded for having an enormously positive culture is Goldman Sachs. To be clear, it was a very performance-oriented culture, but had a very strong culture. This is the Goldman way. For many years, Goldman was just considered a factory of senior leadership because people learned the Goldman way and they took it to other places and it worked very well. It was a very positive culture. Under a lot of attack today, who knows whether they had it right in the past when it was celebrated or right today when it's made fun of. It's more typically associated with professional organizations because it's very normative based. This is simply the way we do things, and it is implicit in that is it is the best way. Certainly in the military, a very culturally based control system. Some things you do, some things you don't do. The next step is rules. It's really easy to make fun of the idea of a rules-based idea of behavioral control because like that's so kindergarten, kiddie car, all that other stuff. We would never do it that way. We want to form teams and build cultures and all that other stuff. And we do, but let's be honest, there are places and companies for whom it works, and you have a sense of companies can operate on different levels. McDonald's is very rule-based at the storefront and those basic employees that are preparing your hamburger and your milkshake and all that other stuff. It's all extremely standardized. It's very clear. This is what you do. This is what you don't do. Rules are sometimes effective when you have a relatively repetitive task, when you have the sort of task where you have high turnover, the sort of job, frankly, where it's not being paid terribly well, so you just don't expect to get that much of an organizational buy-in. It may be that it's not cost effective to get it, that you in fact can get the behavior you want through rules when building a culture is typically a more expensive thing. Obviously, in general, in our hearts, we would like to move away from rule-based organizations to more cultural-based organizations where they exert the control. But we have to be honest and say that rule-based organizations still have a place, even in the 21st century. The last is the idea of rewards. This is where, and it fits very well with the idea of culture, that we basically say those who do a good job get more. And it's fairly hard to argue with that standpoint. The key thing is, though, can you really execute on this? So here's some of the criteria about when you might want to do a reward-based structure. One of the things is performance has to be relatively straightforward. And this is what really trips up some reward systems where they are performance-based reward systems, because we build this person's reward based on their performance, but in reality, there are lots of other people around them that are affecting their performance. And that means they may be able to ride on somebody else's coattails and look better than they should, or it may mean that they're frustrated because they're doing a great job, but the supporting cast around them is dragging them down, and it becomes very demotivational. It says in there, most appropriate organizations pursuing unrelated diversification. This is where each of the units stands on their own, and you basically set financial targets and hold them accountable. And it also makes the point that rewards can be used to reinforce other kinds of control. For example, let's use the very picked on example of Southwest Airlines and its strong culture. A way that they could reinforce the culture is if somehow they were able to collect customer satisfaction surveys and reward, say, station chiefs of various airports where Southwest has an operation. Hey, the station chief of the Kansas City Southwest facility, they have extremely high customer satisfaction ratings, therefore that person gets a better reward because it's consistent with that Southwest, very customer-friendly kind of culture. A little bit more about rewards, and then we'll wrap up this segment. There are, not only are there cultures where rewards work better, but there's organizational structure forms and desired, in addition to desired norms that influence whether performance rewards are likely to work well. So it says that they're most effective when they clear objectives, prompt and clear feedback, but yet they remain flexible. Okay, those are givens. Here's some of the things to think about. If you're in a company where cooperation is highly prized and collaborative effort is highly prized, it becomes difficult to motivate through performance awards, monetary financial performance rewards, because you can't really tease out who's responsible. And if you begin to really reward individual or SBU performance or something like that, that discourages any sort of behavior on the part of one division to help another division improve their performance if it's going to drag them down in the short term. So that's the tricky part. If you prize cooperation, then going to specific unit performance rewards is kind of tricky. And that's why in strong cultures, in some ways, behavioral awards work well, at least for a while. The idea of, instead of giving a reward to the Kansas City people for having the highest customer satisfaction ratings, instead, kind of the Southwest way is that they throw a party and they bring the CEO in and he'd slap them all in the back and say, great job. And in that culture, that's worth a lot. And it doesn't cost anything, or it doesn't cost a lot. So much the better. So when you design a reward system, if you're not careful, you will undercut what you're trying to accomplish. And so it fits in some companies better than others based on culture, and it fits in some organization forms and situations better than others. Are we prizing cooperation amongst a wide group of people, or are we really encouraging competition? And how much do they rely on each other for success? That wraps up the idea of informational behavioral control, and we're going to kind of take a step in the next video and talk about corporate governance. See you in a minute.